Hundreds of thousands of aborted fetal remains are entering our water systems every year. Welcome to Freedom Alive. Abigail Forman is a researcher and policy analyst with Liberty Counsel Action, and she's written a white paper that provides a comprehensive analysis detailing how the same water that we use to drink, cook, and bathe in may contain residuals from abortion drugs. In fact, an estimated 30 to 40 tons of hazardous medical waste, including human remains, are being flushed into the water systems. Abigail joins us to discuss this issue and what we can do about it. I'm blessed to again be joined by our co-host, Matt Staver from Liberty Counsel. And Matt, we know that abortion pills are never safe for women and unborn children. So this is definitely a life issue. But now we're going to look at the environmental consequences of chemical abortions.
You know, it makes sense that this is happening in the sense that when you start to think about it, but it's shocking to see the magnitude of it. And that is these chemical abortions are typically being done where the abortion is in the person's home and the abortion happens over the toilet with the human remains and also the residuals of the abortion drug mifepristone. Abigail Forman is going to talk about this. She has an amazing white paper with a website, abortioninourwater.org, that has a lot of information, PowerPoints and other information that we'll share in her story. But it will be an interview that will shock you, frankly, because it's not just an abortion that's taking place out there somewhere. This is now affecting our water supply. It affects every single person.
Amazing. A startling but true story. We cannot wait to bring it to you. But our Freedom Alert is next, and it's brought to you by Liberty Counsel.
The High Court rules in favor of a Catholic charity. The justices ruled unanimously in the case where Wisconsin's Tax Commission denied a tax exemption to a Catholic Charities chapter. The Catholic Charities Bureau is a social ministry for the Roman Catholic Diocese and provides services to the needy and are available to the public. The charity sought a tax exemption allowed under Wisconsin law, yet it was denied by the state because they did not, quote, proselytize or serve only Catholics. Wisconsin's tax law provides exemptions for religious organizations from having to pay unemployment tax for its employees. The High Court ruled that Wisconsin denied the charity an exemption because its work, while motivated by religious belief, was viewed as primarily secular in nature. This decision now expands the rights of all religious nonprofits across the nation.
Up next, Matt's interview with Abigail Forman.
I'm pleased to welcome to Freedom Alive Abigail Forman, not only a friend but a colleague. She is a public policy analyst and copywriter for Liberty Counsel Action and Liberty Counsel. She's also a former state representative in Minnesota, a former director of public policy for the Right to Life of the UK, and she also is the author of this report, Abortion in Our Water, a special report, Chemical Home Abortions and the Disposition of Aborted Fetal Remains. That's our topic. That's what we want to talk about today with you, Abigail. Welcome to Freedom Alive.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Matt. It's a pleasure to join you.
Well, let's jump right into this issue because there's a lot to cover with regards to chemical abortions and the water supply. There's a chart here, a graphic that you worked on, and you said it happens 700,000 times each and every year. A mother takes an abortion pill. The mother delivers the human remains and flushes them down the toilet. The abortion drug contaminants pollute the water, and the water treatment plants are not designed to remove the abortion waste, which includes not only the drugs, mifepristone, but also the human remains. That's a shocking revelation, I think, to most people, that our water supply is being contaminated by abortion drug residuals and human remains.
Absolutely. And it's something that the federal government absolutely failed to look at when they approved the drug back in 2000. And so, back in 2000, you could argue it was less significant, although we would argue they still violated the law and needed to ensure that any approval of the drug adhered to all state and federal laws. But at any rate, the use of the chemical abortion pill has increased dramatically. You mentioned 700,000, Matt, 700,000 women annually now are taking the pill. That's probably about 70% of the over 1 million abortions that occur annually. But back in 2001, it was 6%. About 6% of abortions were done with the chemical abortion pill. And so given the massive increase in the use of the chemical abortion pill, the effect on our water, what happens when you flush contaminated fetal remains into the sewer system. And as you said, wastewater treatment plants are not equipped to remove these chemical contaminants. What is that doing to our water supply? What is that possibly doing to our drinking water? These are questions the federal government needs to answer. But again, they failed to do so. We can look back at the original approval of the drug in 2000. Like I said, the FDA approved the use of the chemical abortion pill based on a flawed, and I would argue, legally non-compliant environmental assessment. This environmental assessment was done by the Population Council, which itself is a biased entity with roots in eugenicist roots. And they basically looked at drug packaging, plant emissions, and they estimated that the introduction concentration of the pill in the environment would be minimal. So again, that's an estimate. They didn't actually study the effect of the pill in the environment, nor did they even consider the issue of fetal remains. So no actual environmental study was done. These are clear violations of the Clean Water Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. The Clean Water Act specifically says that every activity undertaken by a federal agency that may result or result in, so may result in, it doesn't even have to result in the discharge or the runoff of a pollutant, shall ensure that it abides by all state and federal laws. Well, every state has regulations related to its water quality and related to medical waste disposal. Again, they didn't look at medical waste disposal, so clearly there's a violation of the Clean Water Act there. The Clean Water Act defines a pollutant to include chemical and biological waste. The Clean Water Act also specifically outlines that medical waste can include body parts and blood and things of that nature. So what we have here is that you're potentially, if you're improperly disposing of the fetal remains, you may be polluting the water. And so the federal government should have ensured that those fetal remains were disposed of properly and failed to do so. I can get into the National Environmental Policy Act as well, if that's helpful. But there are. Well,
let me ask you a question here first, because somebody might say, well, this is preposterous. How does this happen? How do we not know this happening? But it's not controversial, is it, that we already have a lot of studies outside of the abortion drug mifepristone, and certainly even putting aside human remains, which is an additional issue, that drugs that go into the toilet actually enter into the water system and are not properly filtered out by the water treatment plants. Isn't that something that's been known for some time, that these chemicals of other drugs, if you flush them down the toilet, will actually go into the water supply and maybe end up in some of our waterways?
Yeah, absolutely. That's been known for a long time. Way back as, 2006, 2009, around there, there was a study by the Environmental Protection Agency and the U.S. Geological Survey that found at least 26 pharmaceuticals in our drinking water. But that in and of itself is concerning. But again, consider that mifepristone is unique in its lethal nature. No other drug causes the death of a child, and no other drug generates medical waste. So we would argue that even though we have these other pharmaceuticals in the water, this is uniquely concerning and calls for heightened scrutiny. Another factor to consider here, or something else to consider, is that the recent Make America Healthy Again Commission, they issued a report. And they talked about a lot of what you just mentioned, Matt. They talked about the pharmaceuticals and various other environmental contaminants in our water, and specifically recommended that we gene map some of these environmental contaminants for the risk of childhood disease, specifically to look at pollutants, pharmaceuticals, and endocrine disruptors. Well, mifepristone is all three. So we would argue, if that's a recommendation of the MAHA report, then make mifepristone a feature in that recommendation. Make sure that
So to begin with, the baseline is we already know that chemicals are entering into the water supply before we even talk about this issue, and they're not being totally filtered out by most treatment plants. That's a baseline. Now you look at mifepristone, and mifepristone blocks progesterone, and so that starves the baby. And so if this gets into the water supply, and it's getting into the water supply by virtue of these abortions are happening primarily in women's homes or in hotels over the toilet, where the chemicals, residuals, are being flushed down the toilet. Now this gets into the water supply. What does that do to fertility rates? What does that do to other people if this drug is designed to kill the developing child and now it enters our water supply?
That is a great question, Matt. And you know what we would posit, what you would think is it's going to cause harm over time. You know, even in low doses, we don't know that for certain because the federal government never studied it. They never did their homework to ensure that the drug would be safe for approval in the U.S. market. But what you just mentioned there, that the pill is a potential endocrine disruptor. It blocks progesterone. Progesterone is, like you say, a vital fertility hormone. Needed for pregnancy to provide nutrients to the baby. It also is a vital fertility hormone in men. And so if what we see here is that you have mifepristone blocking that vital fertility hormone, and then women excrete active metabolites of the drug. So these active metabolites could retain that therapeutic effect. These metabolites could also have the effect of blocking progesterone. And then you see that is potentially in our drinking water. This is what we need to study. We could be having men and women drinking a progesterone blocker. And what do we have in our nation today? We have a fertility crisis. Fertility rates have gone down dramatically in the United States and globally affect 1 in 6 individuals. This is something that Secretary Kennedy actually promised to investigate when he was on the campaign trail, including by looking at potential endocrine disruptors. And because mifepristone is a potential endocrine disruptor, and I would argue because you see a direct correlation, I'm not saying causation, but a direct correlation in the increase in the use of the chemical abortion drug and the decrease in fertility, that's a red flag. We should be raising our eyebrows and asking, what is this doing? And federal government, can you ensure that this is not part of the fertility crisis? Because if not, this is of utmost concern.
You're right. I mean, it's a national catastrophe because it affects everyone. It's a public health crisis. It's not just an abortion is taking place by someone else over there. This actually is coming into our drinking water, or potentially in our drinking water, in our water supply systems that can affect everything around us.
Yep. Well, and they have actually found there's a study that has found wastewater has mifepristone in it, and it's been reported to have been found in freshwater and saltwater. So because it's in water, and because, like we said, conventional drinking water treatment plants are not designed to remove these pharmaceuticals, it's very likely that it is in our drinking water. The other thing that I would just highlight here is that the Environmental Protection Agency has done a lot of study on endocrine disruptors. And again, if you're an endocrine disruptor is something that interferes with your hormones. Progesterone is interfering with your hormones by blocking it. These endocrine disruptors can cause incredibly adverse effects, even in trace amounts over time. They can have profound impacts, particularly at developmental stages. So think puberty, think pregnant women, et cetera, even in very trace amounts. So we're saying, again, the federal government needs to do its homework and needs to ensure that the American people are not being harmed by this drug. The other thing, like I said before, there's a violation here of some state and federal laws. And so the federal government should go back, do what it should have done in the first instance, and ensure that all state and federal laws are adhered to related to water quality, as well as medical waste disposal. Medical waste disposal laws exist in every state. When you generate medical waste as a provider, so if you're a doctor or an abortion provider, you have to ensure it's disposed of in a sanitary manner. Consider that in a surgical abortion, the provider is not handing the woman the fetal remains back and saying, here, you dispose of this. No, they're ensuring that medical waste, and let me pause, it's not medical waste. You and I know that it's a life, right? But even if you disagree with that, at the very least, it constitutes what is defined as medical waste: blood, body parts, developing cranial structures, things of that nature. And so it needs to be disposed of properly. Incineration is one method, for example. But at any rate, in a chemical abortion providers have essentially been able to use toilets and instruct women. They instruct women to sit on the toilet and just, see what happens. They're using wastewater treatment plants as their de facto medical waste facilities. This is a gross violation of several state laws, as well as, like I said, a national scandal, because Students for Life of America, for example, estimates that about 40 tons of medical waste are entering our waterways every year. Consider if a hospital said, oh, we're dumping, 40 tons of medical waste into the sewer system. That would be a national scandal. Well, this is a national scandal.
Well, even cruise ships, you remember they used to dump their waste in the oceans. They can't do that now. You would be fined for doing that because you don't want to put the waste, human waste, into the ocean. But if you now have the baseline of, we know that for some time in these other studies, chemicals, residuals of different kinds of chemicals and drugs are entering the water supply. They're not being filtered out. And then we now know that mifepristone is going into the water supply, and it's going into the water supply at increasing rates as this pill becomes more widely used. But in addition to the chemicals, have we ever done any research about human remains, body parts, flesh, blood, all of that going into the water supply? That's a whole different area that is shocking and frankly frightening.
Yep, absolutely. And I would argue as well, it's disturbing to our relationship to the environment, right? So if you're, going to go swimming in your local lakes or rivers, and then you're thinking about the fact that there could be, granted it would be at a higher molecular level, that remains of aborted babies, that's disturbing. In fact, that's one of the things that they should have considered back in 2000. So the National Environmental Policy Act, which I had mentioned earlier, that law requires that agencies consider the unquantified value of certain environmental benefits in their decision-making, that they give them appropriate consideration. Well, I would argue there is absolutely an unquantified value of an environment that's free of aborted fetal remains, right? There's a value there. Not only was that not given any consideration, because like I said, I can't underscore this enough, they failed to consider how this medical waste would be disposed of. It wasn't given any consideration. Consider as well that when you're thinking about this drug mifepristone, in 2000 it was a novel drug. Never before had a drug been introduced to the U.S. market, and I would, still today, there's no drug that generates medical waste. This is an extraordinary circumstance that the government should have considered. If you're going to be generating medical waste, how are you going to dispose of it? They knew, I would argue, the FDA, the Population Council, they knew this would happen, but they ignored it and assumed that they would get away with the illegal disposition of fetal remains by flushing them down the toilet or telling women to do their dirty work for them.
So what's going down the toilet are things such as placenta and the baby itself. And, there's another whole issue there about the trauma that this causes, because chemical abortions, we now are hearing stories causing much more trauma than surgical abortions, because in a surgical abortion, you may be anesthetized, or you don't see the results of your abortion and a third party does it to you. But in the chemical abortions, you're the one who's actually taking the pill, and then you're the one who actually sees the little baby floating in the toilet, sometimes still struggling to have breath and life. And you see the results of what you've done. So the trauma is huge, greater than even surgical abortion. And then all of that gets flushed down to the toilet into the waste system. What about the waste treatment plants? Are they not able to filter out let's talk about two different levels, the chemicals, number one, and then number two, have they even ever been designed to filter out human remains?
So wastewater treatment plants, conventional wastewater treatment plants, are not designed to remove pharmaceutical contaminants. We know this, like we mentioned before, it's been studied. So those pharmaceutical contaminants go all the way through, they enter our water supply. And as I said, mifepristone has been found in freshwater and saltwater, and it's very likely then entering our drinking water, because drinking water treatment plants are also not designed to remove pharmaceuticals. When it comes to the human remains, this issue as well, wastewater treatment plants were not designed to remove human remains. Why would they be?
Why would you even think about having human remains in a water supply? Chemicals is one thing, and they can't do that. But you would never think about disposing of a human body in a water supply.
Exactly. And, the other issue with this is and I hate to be so graphic, but I think people need to understand this. Consider the size of the fetal remains, from 0 to 10 weeks and likely beyond 10 weeks, you can use the abortion pill. A 10-week fetus is at least an inch and a half, and then beyond that, because women are not required to go to the doctor to get an ultrasound to know how far along they are. We know that abortions with these chemical pills happen at even later gestations. And so it's an even larger baby that then is going into pipes. There have been reports of people finding fetal remains clogging pipes. Then if they do make it to the wastewater treatment plant, they can get caught in the wastewater treatment screens because, you screen out the larger materials. It's meant for things like sticks, et cetera. But wastewater treatment plant workers have also been traumatized by finding fetal remains that are getting into these wastewater treatment plants. And if they get through the screens, that they can still find them in other parts of the plant. This is atrocious. This is a national crisis. Consider as well, back in 2009, there was a report on placenta being found in the wastewater treatment facilities, I believe in Illinois. And a state EPA spokesperson said it's never acceptable to put placenta down the drain. Never. Yet we're doing it every single day, 700,000 times a year. The EPA is turning a blind eye to this. And I'm not saying the current EPA, I believe, Zeldin is doing a great job, and I'm hoping and praying he'll look at this. And, we know that we have promises from other leaders of federal agencies to look at this. But this is something that people need to be aware of so that they can be advocating for their lawmakers to make a change as well.
Now, this is obviously new to a lot of people and probably no doubt shocking to a lot of people. But I know Liberty Counsel Action has a website, and it is abortioninourwater.org, abortioninourwater.org. And on that website, there is this very detailed, nearly 90-page document, 8.5 by 11, single space. Can people get this, download it? And I know you also have some other resources there on abortioninourwater.org, that special webpage, that Liberty Counsel Action's webpage.
Yep, you can get the report. You can download the full report. You can download the one-page executive summary. You can download that graphic that you held up earlier, as well as a few other resources like action steps. So the things that you can talk to your federal lawmaker, your state lawmaker about. Particularly, we want to ask the federal government to suspend the use of the pill until it does a legally compliant environmental assessment and until it does gold standard scientific research. The gold standard research should include being subject to peer review, unbiased peer review. We know that was not the case with mifepristone. So ask your federal lawmakers to take these steps, and then ask the EPA as well to monitor mifepristone and to do its research as well.
And what would be the process for viewers, for example, when they go to abortioninourwater.org and they see some of this material? What's the next step that they can take?
Absolutely great question. So if you find our action steps page and you download that, you'll be able to click on a link that will help you to find your federal lawmakers. And then for your state lawmakers, you want to do the same thing. So find out who your state lawmakers are. And then you want to contact them, give them a call, email them, and ask them, hey, what are our state laws on fetal disposition? What are our state medical waste laws? Are we violating these every single day by allowing abortion providers to tell women to flush their aborted babies? And I should say, be respectful. Some of these lawmakers may have no idea. This is like you say, it's shocking information. But once you know it, you can't unknow it.
So, Abigail, in the final minutes that you've got here with us, what would you say in some conclusive remarks, and how do we proceed from here?
Yeah, I would say the first things first is let's be praying for a change in our national government in terms of the way they think about this issue. And then let's make sure we're bringing awareness to this issue. We want Congress to hold hearings to make sure that this mifepristone contamination, both the fetal remains and the chemical waste, the metabolites, are being reviewed and researched to determine what is this doing to Americans' health? What is this doing possibly to Americans' fertility? And what can we do? What can the federal government do to ensure the cleanest drinking water for Americans? And that's something that President Trump has promised. He wants to see clean drinking water, and we want to help him. So I would say let's be focusing on that and praying that we can clean up our water supplies.
Well, thank you, Abigail. Abigail Forman, she is our guest today. She is a public policy analyst and copywriter for Liberty Counsel Action, also Liberty Counsel, former state legislator in Minnesota, former director of public policy for Right to Life UK, an incredible researcher and advocate on this and many other issues as well. The website specially designed just for this issue is abortioninourwater.org, abortioninourwater.org. Lots of resources there. I encourage you to go there. Share that link with members of Congress, with your friends, with people in your church, and also with state legislators and local legislators as well, local elected officials in your city or county governments. They need to know this as well because they all have wastewater treatment plants and they would like to know this material. Thank you, Abigail, for joining us. You can also fax from that webpage as well. Lots of resources. Abigail Forman, thank you for being with us on Freedom Alive.
Thank you, Matt. It's been a pleasure as always.
Matt, I'm thankful to bring clarity to such an unbelievable issue. And I think in speaking for, I believe probably many people watching this, as it was with me, this is shocking to hear this and just the opportunity to create this epiphany for people and help them understand really what's at play here. And Abigail uses the words national scandal, and that's
it's a national scandal. It's a public health risk.
Absolutely.
Because it affects everyone. And so it doesn't matter where you land on this issue of abortion, whether you have one view versus another. It doesn't really matter. What matters is on this particular issue, you don't want your water contaminated. You certainly don't want your water contaminated by human remains, and you don't want your water contaminated by these endocrine disruptors with progesterone blocking types of medication from mifepristone going into your water supply. And we know that it is. We know for a fact that it's happening. The real question is how much concentration is it when it comes into the various water systems. And that's research that needs to be done, but it's never been done because they just ignored it. They ignored the very fact that these abortions are happening in homes. Unlike a surgical abortion where it's happening in a brick and mortar facility, and they are supposed to have laws that dispose of the medical waste, the human remains. Here, where the human remains are being disposed of is in the toilet, in the homes.
Please get involved. Please pray for Matt and the Liberty Counsel team. This is a big undertaking around a very, very serious issue where we have to move the ball and make improvements. It just has to happen. In closing, remember Galatians 5, verse 1, which says, "It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery." Our freedom is a gift from our Creator. We must never forget that and always protect it. Join us here next time where you'll hear victories as well as ways you can stand up for your priceless freedom. Join us again for Freedom Alive.